Welcome back to my YouTube channel. I used to tell myself that evil was something distant, something that lived in headlines and nightmares, not in families bound by marriage and shared dinners. But the day I stood by Lake Fairfield, clutching a dripping suitcase with trembling hands, I learned how quietly horror can disguise itself. I had only stopped by the lake house to drop off a few things for my son and his wife, Marissa. From the moment I stepped out of the car, something felt off. Marissa was already by the dock, her hair wild, her shoulders tight. She didn't see me, maybe she didn't care to. I watched, frozen, as she dragged a large, scuffed suitcase to the edge of the pier. She paused, scanned the area like a hunted animal, then with both hands shoved the suitcase into the water. It hit the surface with a sickening splash and bobbed once before sinking halfway. My first thought was confusion. Old clothes? Trash? But the way she sprinted back toward her car without looking behind her sent a chill straight through me. And then I heard it. A muffled thump. Then another. And I swear to God, something like a tiny cry. I didn't think. I ran. I was 72 years old, but in that moment my legs belonged to a woman half my age. The water was icy, numbing my feet as I waded in and grabbed the handle sticking out. The suitcase was heavier than anything I've lifted in years, but panic gives you strength you don't know you have. The zipper was jammed. My fingers slipped on the wet fabric. I yanked, clawed, and finally tore it open. Inside was a newborn. Purple-faced, slick with sweat and panic, wrapped in a blanket so tight it looked deliberate. For a heartbeat, I couldn't breathe. My mind refused to believe. My heart begged for it not to be what it was, but she moved, a weak, desperate twitch. I let out a sound I've never heard from myself before. I scooped her up, pressing her to my chest, whispering her name even before I knew it. My granddaughter, my son's child, a life thrown away like luggage. As I called 911 with shaking hands, 100 questions blazed through me. Why hadn't my son mentioned the baby's birth? Why had Marissa hidden it? And what pain or darkness could drive a woman to do something so monstrous? Hours later, in a blur of police, EMTs, and shocking confessions, the truth surfaced. Postpartum psychosis, isolation, fear, secrets buried under pride and pressure. She hadn't asked for help. No one saw the signs. And I, who pride myself on sensing storms before they break, had missed everything. My granddaughter survived. By some miracle, she is breathing, healing, living. But I carry the memory of that day like a scar stitched into my bones. And here's what I need every woman, every mother, every mother-in-law, every friend to hear. Silence is the soil where devastation grows. We must stop assuming strength means smiling through terror. We must stop treating motherhood like a test of endurance instead of a calling that requires community. And when something feels wrong, no matter how small, no matter how awkward it is to ask, we must act. I don't know what would have happened if I'd arrived 5 minutes later. I do know this. I will never again ignore a whisper of instinct, and neither should you. I used to believe that danger announced itself with sirens, shadows, or the kind of drama you could point at and say, "There, that's the moment everything went wrong." But life doesn't always give us that clarity. Sometimes it creeps in quietly, disguised in familiar faces and ordinary mornings. That day at Lake Fairfield was supposed to be just that, ordinary. I'd baked a small blueberry loaf, the kind my son loved as a boy, and decided to drop it off along with a few baby blankets I'd knitted in secret, hoping, praying, that Marissa might finally share some sliver of news about the child I suspected she was carrying. The air was crisp, the kind that bites at your cheeks but smells of pine and clean water. I remember thinking the lake looked like glass, calm, untroubled, deceptive. From the driveway, I noticed Marissa's car parked crookedly, as though she'd arrived in a rush or tried to leave before deciding otherwise. The passenger door was still slightly ajar. I called out her name once, softly, not wanting to startle her if she was resting or on the phone. No answer. I stepped around the side of the house, expecting to see her on the porch or near the kitchen window, but she was nowhere in sight. That's when I caught a glimpse of movement near the dock. At first, I couldn't quite make out what she was doing, just the hunched posture, the way her shoulders strained under her coat. The sun was low, casting a glare across the water, and I had to shield my eyes to see clearly. Then she dragged something, large, dark, and heavy, across the wooden planks. The scraping sound cut through the quiet like teeth on stone. My first instinct wasn't fear, but confusion. I remember thinking it was luggage, maybe old seasonal clothes she planned to throw out or donations she'd loaded wrong. But the way she moved told another story. She wasn't just disposing of something, she was trying to get rid of it fast. She paused at the edge of the dock, glancing over her shoulder with a frantic, hunted expression. Even from a distance, I could see her chest heaving, her hands trembling as they gripped the handle. I didn't call her name that time. I didn't even breathe. I just watched, frozen, as she pushed the suitcase forward with a force that came from panic, not strength. The splash wasn't loud, but it was wrong, too heavy, too intentional. The water swallowed the suitcase halfway, making it bob before dipping slightly under. Marissa didn't linger. She didn't even look to see if anyone had watched. She turned and almost stumbled as she hurried back up the dock, her coat flapping behind her like wings made of fear. In that moment, I didn't yet understand what I was witnessing, but something inside me, some ancient, maternal instinct older than logic, stirred hard and fast. I set down the blueberry loaf on the nearest bench, without realizing I'd let it slip from my hands. My pulse thudded so loudly in my ears I could barely hear anything else. I wish I could say I acted immediately out of certainty. The truth is, it was something else. Intuition, dread, a flicker of knowing that didn't need evidence to take root. All I knew was that nothing about what I'd just seen was ordinary, and whatever that suitcase held, it wasn't meant to be forgotten by the lake. I stood there for a moment that felt stretched thin and brittle, like the air itself was holding its breath with me. I watched Marissa's back as she hurried toward her car, her steps uneven, almost stumbling, as if the weight she'd just discarded was still clinging to her ankles. Something in me wanted to call out. Her name was right there on the tip of my tongue, but another part of me held it back. She didn't look like a woman who wanted to be stopped. She looked like someone running from the sound of her own thoughts. I took a slow step toward the edge of the dock, my shoes crunching lightly over the frost-crusted wood. The suitcase was still partially visible, the top half submerged and the handle sticking up like a hand reaching for help. It bobbed gently, making small ripples that spread across the lake's surface, as though the water itself was uneasy about what it had just received. I could taste metal in my mouth, fear or dread I couldn't tell. Then it came, so faint I almost convinced myself I imagined it. A dull thud from inside the suitcase, muted by the layers of fabric and water. I froze, my head tilting ever so slightly, my ears straining against the quiet. For a heartbeat there was nothing, just the soft slap of water against the dock. And then again, another thump, more desperate, followed by what sounded like a weak, muffled whimper. The world around me fell away. The cold bit into my fingertips, but I didn't feel it. My heart slammed against my ribs, every beat shouting at me to move. One breath and I was already in motion. I didn't think about how deep the water was, or how ridiculous I must have looked sprinting toward the edge at my age. All I knew was that there was something alive in that suitcase, and it was running out of air. The wooden planks rattled under my feet as I hurried down the dock, the wind cutting across my face like needles. My shoes slipped slightly near the end, but I caught myself, gripping the railing for balance. I knelt without caring that my dress slacks were soaking up the cold dampness, reaching out and grabbing the handle of the suitcase with both hands. The fabric was slick and frigid, sending a shiver straight into my bones. It was heavier than I expected, dragging against the pressure of the water as I hauled it toward me. My knees screamed in protest, but adrenaline drowned out the pain. I gritted my teeth and pulled harder, inch by inch, the sound inside growing quieter, fainter, as though whatever, or whoever, was trapped was losing strength. When I finally managed to drag the suitcase fully onto the dock, water poured from the seams in thin streams pooling around my legs. I could hear my own breathing, ragged and uneven, louder than the lake or the wind or anything else. For one terrifying second, the thumping stopped entirely, and the silence that followed felt like the edge of a cliff. I didn't wait to see if Marissa was still nearby. I didn't look toward the road or think about calling for help. All that existed in that moment was the zipper and my shaking hands, the pounding of my heart, and the horrifying certainty that whatever waited inside would change everything. My fingers were trembling so violently I could barely grip the zipper. The metal was wet and icy, and every attempt to pull it downward met resistance, like the suitcase itself was fighting me. I dug my nails into the fabric and yanked harder, my breath catching in my throat as the teeth of the zipper scraped and snagged. My mind was a blur of prayers and panic. Please, please, please. And I didn't even know exactly what I was begging for. Just that I wasn't too late. For a few agonizing seconds, the zipper refused to budge. My hand slipped again, and a sharp jolt of frustration shot through me. I braced the suitcase against my knees, forced my shaking fingers to steady, and pulled with every ounce of strength panic had given me. This time it gave way, an ugly tearing sound splitting the air as a section of the seam ripped open with it. The scent that hit me was damp fabric, lake water, and something faintly sweet, like baby lotion clinging to cloth. I shoved the flap back, and what I saw inside hollowed the breath right out of my lungs. A tiny bundle was crammed into the suitcase, swaddled too tightly in a pale yellow blanket. For a moment, my mind refused to comprehend it, my brain stumbling over the sight as though it were a terrible illusion. But then the blanket shifted, just barely, a weak twitch of movement that shattered any denial I had left. Her skin was mottled and pale, her lips tinged with blue, and the soft fuzz of her hair was damp and plastered against her forehead. She wasn't crying anymore. She wasn't making any sound at all. That silence was the loudest thing I'd ever heard. My heart lurched so violently I thought it might stop altogether. I reached in with both arms and lifted her out, my hands slipping under the soaked fabric as though she were made of the thinnest glass. The weight of her was both light and terrifying, a life so small it barely filled my arms, yet heavy with the horror of what had almost happened. Her little chest moved in shallow, uneven rises, each one a fragile question mark against the cold air. I pressed her against me without thinking, my coat instantly soaking through, her cheek cold against my collarbone. My voice cracked on a sound I didn't recognize as my own as I whispered, "I've got you, I've got you, I've got you," over and over like a spell to pull her back from the edge. My heart was pounding so hard it hurt, each beat sending a tremor through my body. I could feel myself start to shake, not just from the cold, but from the horror of understanding exactly what I was holding and what I had just pulled out of that lake. I didn't stop to scan the road or wonder if Marissa was watching. I didn't let myself think about why or how. All that mattered was that she was breathing, that one impossible, miraculous breath at a time was still happening. I fumbled for my phone with one hand, clutching the baby with the other, my fingers barely able to swipe the screen. The world around me blurred at the edges, dock, trees, sky, all of it distant and irrelevant compared to the tiny, shivering life pressing faint warmth into my chest. The universe had narrowed to one impossible truth. I had found her in time, but time was still racing against us. My fingers could barely press the buttons on my phone. I don't even remember what I said when the dispatcher answered, just fragments, my voice cracking as I tried to force words out fast enough to matter. "A baby. She's not breathing right. By Lake Fairfield. Please hurry." I must have repeated the location 3 times because I could hear the dispatcher's calm voice telling me to stay on the line. But the world around me was beating too loud for her words to stick. I shrugged off my coat and wrapped it around the baby, pulling it tight, trying to trap whatever warmth I had left in my body against hers. Her skin was damp and cold, and her breaths were so faint they barely lifted the blanket. I pressed my cheek against the top of her head and whispered nonsense, soft sounds, promises she couldn't understand, but I prayed she could feel. My knees were soaked through, and I could feel the lake water seeping into my shoes, but I didn't dare stand. The wind cut across the dock, and every gust made me flinch, terrified it might steal the heat from her before help arrived. I kept one hand on her tiny back, feeling the rise and fall, counting each breath like it was gold slipping through my fingers. A car door slammed somewhere up the path, and instinctively my head snapped up. For a second, I thought it might be Marissa coming back, or worse, running further away. But the sound faded, and there was no one in sight. The silence pressed in again, heavy and sharp, interrupted only by the occasional creak of the dock and the faint lap of the water against the wood. I looked back at the suitcase lying open beside me, water pooling around it. The inside was soaked through, the lining clinging to itself like wilted skin. There was nothing else in it. No clothes, no notes, no sign that this was anything but deliberate. The sight of it made my stomach twist so violently I had to look away. My son's face flashed in my mind, his laugh as a boy, the day he introduced Marissa to us, the quiet pride when he told me he wanted a family of his own. I had asked him a dozen times in the last few months if everything was all right, if the baby had come, if they needed anything. Every time he'd brushed me off kindly, distracted with work, saying Marissa was tired but fine. I had believed him, or maybe I'd simply wanted to. A faint, fragile cry bubbled from the baby's lips, more a gasp than a sound, and every muscle in my body jolted with it. I shifted her in my arms, trying to keep her head supported, my breath catching as her eyelids fluttered. Her face was still too pale, but that tiny spark of sound gave me something I could cling to. I whispered her name, though I didn't know it, calling her sweetheart, baby girl, anything to anchor her here. In the distance, I heard the wail of sirens, a thin, rising echo carried by the wind. Relief hit me in a crushing wave that stole my strength, making my shoulders sag and my vision blur. I held her closer, pressing my lips to her forehead, my heartbeat thundering against her as if I could loan her its rhythm. I didn't think about explanations or consequences or who would be blamed. All I could feel was the fragile weight in my arms and the terrifying certainty that if I hadn't come when I did, she would have vanished into the dark water without a sound, without a name, without a chance. The paramedics arrived in a blur of motion and urgency, their boots thudding across the dock as I cradled the baby against me. One of them, a young man with wide, steady eyes, knelt beside me and spoke gently, but I could barely process his words. I only remember the moment he reached for her, the instinctive panic that surged through me, and the way I hesitated, clutching her tighter before I forced myself to let go. My hands felt suddenly empty and useless the moment she left my arms. They wrapped her in thermal blankets and placed a tiny oxygen mask over her mouth and nose. I could hear one of them muttering vitals under his breath, his tone clipped with concern. Another spoke into a radio with quick precision, calling in what sounded like a pediatric emergency team to meet them at the hospital. I hovered beside them, soaked to the bone, shivering from something far colder than the lake water. A police officer approached me, his expression caught somewhere between confusion and disbelief. He glanced at the open suitcase, then at me, then back toward the winding road that led to the lake house. His voice was low and careful when he asked what happened, but the words jammed in my throat. My tongue felt thick, my mind too full and too blank all at once. I managed only fragments, suitcase, in the water, I heard. Before he held up a hand, telling me to breathe, to take my time. Another officer headed toward the house, speaking into his radio. I could see him scanning the driveway where Marissa's car had been, the tire tracks still fresh in the damp earth. I didn't know if she was still nearby or already vanished down the road, but the thought of her slipping away twisted something deep inside me. They wanted me to sit, but I couldn't. I kept my eyes on the paramedics as they carried the baby up the dock, her tiny form so small in their arms it nearly disappeared inside the bundle of blankets. I followed them to the ambulance without thinking, my feet moving of their own accord. Every step felt both too heavy and too light, my body numb and buzzing at the same time. The officer who'd spoken to me jogged to catch up and asked for my name, my relation, anything that would make sense of why I was there. His questions were gentle, but they scraped raw against my shock. I gave him my name, my son's, the address of the lake house, all while my eyes stayed locked on the open doors of the ambulance. I heard myself say, "That's my grandchild," and the words landed in the air like something both sacred and broken. As they loaded her inside, I caught one last glimpse of her small hand peeking from the blanket, the fingers curled weakly, barely moving. That image seared itself into me so deeply I knew I'd see it every time I closed my eyes. The doors shut with a hollow thump, and the siren began to wail again, louder this time, urgent and unignorable. The vehicle pulled away in a spray of gravel and exhaust, taking her toward whatever hope waited down the road. I stood there on the cold gravel, hair clinging wet to my face, clothes heavy with lake water, and felt my heartbeat thudding against the quiet the ambulance left behind. In that ringing silence, the truth of what I had witnessed began to unspool inside me, slow, jagged, impossible to outrun.